Thank you, Governor Dean. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Secretary Togo West. Secretary West served with distinction in a number of positions across the U.S. government, including the Department of Justice, the Department of Navy, and the Department of Defense. From 1993 to 1997, he served as Secretary of the Army, where he led a workforce of over 1 million soldiers and 270,000 civilian employees. More recently, Secretary West served as Secretary of Veterans Affairs during the presidency of Bill Clinton, starting in 1998. Please join me in welcoming Secretary West.
Thank you. Well, I have a number of issues to resolve before I start. First of all, thank you for welcoming me to your gathering. This is my first time. There's a Marine here who looked a little surprised to hear that I had a claim to Navy, but then I was there as Navy General Counsel a while back. Most people think of me as an Army person. Secondly, I hoped against hope that mine would not be the next name called. After those two stirring presentations, the first which covered the waterfront and said everything we need to say today, and the second which just sort of grabbed us and lifted us out of our chairs with pride both in both nations. And so a further thank you for allowing me to be part of that experience and more to come. And thirdly, to say something more about why I'm here and how I come to be here. Because you can say, well, we heard what he did. For one thing, he's part of an administration that didn't act on the issue of the list. That would be the administration in which, in fact, part of the administration which actually put the MEK on the list in the first place. For that was a time when I served as both Secretary of the Army in the first part of the Clinton administration, and the Secretary of Veterans Affairs in the second. But my interest, my concern, my involvement goes back before that. I can reflect many decades ago as a young officer in the United States Army being in Tehran. I was there in roughly 1972. Young officer, a captain, an Army lawyer, traveling with the then Secretary of the Army, Robert Foulke. And as part of a number of stops he made, we spent the better part of a week there meeting with General Tafanian, the defense minister, and with other senior officials. I was able to walk around about the streets, to get to see people, to look in faces, and to enjoy the fact that they're willing to look back into my face, to be smiled and receive a smile in return. In short, to be welcomed and warmed by the Iranian people. That was years ago. I remember those days to this moment. I've had some other involvements over time as part of my professional career. We don't need to get into those at this moment. But I do want to say that that's why we're here. We're here because of the warmth, the resilience, and the desire to be free of the Iranian people. There are lots of other things that flow from that, but that's why I believe you're here. It is certainly why I am here. So let me, if I may, so that I don't repeat the areas already covered by others, and you may think that's a little difficult for me to do, or that will be covered, but perhaps I can give a different perspective, start here. For all that, Governor Dean is correct when he says that we meet here in the United States where the interests of the United States tend to dominate public discourse about international matters and the country's role in those international matters. And so, it is fair to say that from the point of view of the United States government, whether it is this administration or previous ones, with respect to Iran, they've had at least 4 considerations. Of course, the one that so many in government consider overriding, and perhaps they're right, and that is the nuclear concern. Secondly, what I think the American government would certainly believe to be the Iranian government's tendency to meddle in the Middle East and in the regional affairs of its neighbors and certainly to the great detriment of those of our service members who serve just across the border in Iraq. Thirdly and fourthly, and for you and me, firstly and secondly, or even firstly and firstly, because of the plight at Camp Ashraf, and because we have unfinished business in this nation with respect to the MEK. Now, if you and I conclude that those are among the things that seem to percolate and be taken into consideration and to go through the decision-making process in the United States government, especially in the State Department, assuming my colleagues are willing to agree that there is a process of decision-making with respect to these matters in the State Department, then perhaps we can get a better sense of why it has taken so long to resolve matters correctly with respect to the MEK delisting. And maybe we can understand some of that, but that does not mean we can agree with it. Or we can't conclude, as I think one of my colleagues is going to say, but since he mentioned it to me earlier, that our current Secretary of State has already had more than a year to resolve it. Don't misunderstand me. I'm a great admirer of the current Secretary of State. One of the things that does not get mentioned in my bio is that when she was First Lady and traveled abroad to our to one of the locales in which we were engaged in conflict, I traveled with her, met her, and escorted her around because most of the troops she would visit were Army troops, and I was then the Secretary of the Army. And when she cast her hat in the ring to run for the presidency, I was there too, encouraging her and hoping that she could win the leadership of this nation. I have great respect for her. If you look at her bio, if you look at her history, she was in high school and in college, she was the teacher's pet. She was the one who did the study, who came prepared, who applied clear analysis, and who spoke convincingly and openly about her beliefs. I'm of the opinion that those qualities will bring her to a point where I will make a prediction others won't, that she will act in great likelihood after all the toing and froing to do the right thing with respect to the MEK listing and to delist the MEK. That is not our question. Our question is when, how long, how much more information needs to be reviewed. The State Department has not even responded to the Court of Appeals ruling of last year just yet. And for that, I have no answer. And I think the best we can do is to continue the pressure that you exert and that these groups exert and that forthright statements like those made by my two predecessors can exert. But I believe there is hope on that issue. I am less than clear on what our government is going to do about Camp Ashraf, and it troubles me greatly. We have already stepped away. We have already turned it over to the Iraqi forces. And each day, our influence on the government of Iraq diminishes. Why? Because we are in the process of withdrawing. I think that as strongly and as loudly and as vigorously as we can, we need to continue to pressure the administration, to pressure anybody with any ability to have an influence on this, to see that the residents are not just protected, but are provided for going forward. I agree with what has been said about the disaster that arises if they are forced to relocate inside Iraq. I agree that the United States continues to have a responsibility for that, and I urge the United States to step up to that responsibility. There are, over the history of these issues, what are clearly three decision points, and they've been touched on already. Let me touch on them again. There was the decision point by one Secretary of State to add the MEK to the terrorist list, to the list of terrorist organizations. There was a decision by a second Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, upon review, not to act to remove them. We now have a third Secretary of State whose duty is clear and who has the added incentive, or perhaps it's the added support. Let's assume that she wants to do us right. The added support of the decision by the court and of the continued hearings and statements from the Hill. I'm always disappointed when I hear us refer to those who are supporting the Iraqi government and their oppression of the residents of Camp Ashraf as the Iranians or the Iranian nation. I'm always distressed when I hear us talk about the policies of Iran, because I am reminded, and I remind each of us, a nation is not its leaders. A nation is its people. If we remember that, if we rely on that, if that is the way we address problems, then Iran is in fine shape because of the fine attitudes and determination of its people. We just have to get its government in order, and that is the job of the Iranian people. The job of the United States is to assist them to exert all of its power, all of its influence, and every bit of its reputation as a nation historically supportive of democracy, to support that effort in every way. I think we're here for the Iranian people. That is where I started. I think our role in the United States has always been to reach out and nurture other efforts to establish, maintain, and preserve democracy. That is how we got started. This nation, in its revolution, in its birth in freedom, would not have succeeded if other nations, especially France, had not been willing to reach out and help us nurture our aspirations of democracy. And so it comes full circle. We owe our democracy as much to the assistance from other countries as we do to our own spirit. Can we do any less for the good people of Iran, whose only wish, whose only ambition is to produce the very same effort to decide from themselves how they will be governed? I thank you for the opportunity to join you. And I say this, I was once in Tehran. I was once able to walk the streets and to greet people and be greeted. I hope someday that you will invite me back there again.